injections within the 3 months before he died. And these weren't small doses, 300 milligrams a pop.
Oh, no, that's absurd. There's categorically no justification.
Bedside when he died, it's just mind-boggling. 22 different meds prescribed by at least 4 different doctors from 4 different pharmacies. And a lot of these prescriptions didn't even have the patient's name or the doctor's name on the label. The labels were just blank.
A single frame changes everything. In 2025, whispers ripple across the internet, fueled by footage so clear and vibrant it defies belief. There, in the muted glow of a mansion that breathes with its own history, a figure glides, unmistakably Michael Jackson. Not the spectral memories etched in grainy concert reels, but a presence that seems untouched by time, fluid, precise, impossibly alive. His dance, a spontaneous spin, an effortless gesture, renders silence obsolete as new music drifts through the air, sharp as a confession. Screens worldwide flicker to life, headlines chase the revelation, and fans are forced to confront the unthinkable. Was Michael Jackson ever truly gone? As this footage electrifies the globe, the question is no longer just a rumor or dream. It stands at the center of a mystery that will rewrite everything believed about the king of pop. On a night when rain traced silver threads along shuttered windows, the gates of a secluded estate stood still, an island of quiet within a city that never fully sleeps. The landscape, carefully tended, carried the memory of public spectacle into a private hush. Palm trees angled against the wind, the glow of security lamps painting long rectangles across a marble drive, and a house that seemed to hold its breath behind its high, dark facade. In this moment, the mansion appeared almost ceremonial, a monument to a life lived under 1,000 spotlights, now paused in the quiet of a storm-stilled hour. The narrative that would unfold began not with a shout, but with a series of small, almost procedural occurrences. The buzzing of a security corridor, the soft click of a door, the muted steps of staff moving in predictable rhythms, all recorded by systems designed to observe without intruding. The exterior, though imposing, carried an air of restraint. Stone walls bore the weight of history, while modern fixtures suggested a continuance rather than a rupture. Inside, the rooms stretched like galleries, each corner housing memories rather than mere furniture. An anteroom held a quiet assortment of preserved costumes, a reminder of performances that altered the tempo of culture around the world. Hallways led to a study where the quiet hum of electronic devices filled the space with a steady, patient presence. In this environment, the normal cadence of a celebrity's residence, interviews, rehearsals, and the day-to-day life of a household appeared to have been condensed into a single, uninterrupted moment of containment. The turning point arrived not with a flourish, but with the careful, methodical actions of those responsible for security and welfare. A call went through the system, a routine ping that suggested something beyond routine. Responders moved with practiced calm, their steps measured, their voices lowered to maintain order while they ascertained the situation. In the rooms beyond the foyer, a figure emerged, not wrapped in folklore or rumor, but presented to the observers as a living individual, someone who carried the unmistakable silhouette of a person long associated with monolithic public attention. The scene carried a paradox: the public memory of a performer who had already become a legend, and the tangible presence of a person who stood within the walls of a private, guarded retreat. The reactions around him were cautious, respectful, and intensely attentive, as if the space itself demanded a careful, deliberate approach to understanding what this moment meant. What followed was a sequence of observations that treated the extraordinary as something that could be examined with the same care used to study any long-awaited revelation. The environment remained reverent yet practical. Staff and authorities spoke in measured tones, describing the state of the premises with precise, unembellished language. The man, whose public identity had shaped generations of fans, appeared older but not diminished, a living archive who carried with him the weight of decades of music, performance, and cultural influence. There was time to notice the details, the way light caught a sequined garment draped over a chair, the arrangement of awards that lined a corridor, the quiet rhythms of a house designed to host performers while preserving a sense of personal sanctuary. These details connected the personal with the public, the intimate with the iconic, offering viewers a window into how a life of spectacle can coexist with the ordinary demands of a private residence. As witnesses evaluated the event, the air carried a density that suggested more than surprise. It suggested a moment of cultural weather, a point at which the boundary between myth and memory might be renegotiated. The mansion, in its mannered stillness, became a stage not for fiction, but for a clarifying contrast. The difference between the myth of a figure who shaped a century of music and the tangible presence of that figure within the walls of a home designed to protect both privacy and history. Outside, the rain continued, a steady drumbeat that echoed through the rooms and underscored the resonance of a moment that would be discussed in hours and years to come. The scenes that followed, conversations, examinations, and the careful preservation of the space, were not sensational, but rather the choreography of a revelation assessed with the patience of researchers and the empathy owed to anyone stepping back into the world after a long absence. This was not merely a rediscovery. It was a complicated re-entry into a cultural conversation that had. From the moment the world learned of his death, the story felt final, a line drawn in the noise of cameras and confetti. Yet stories, especially the ones we tell about fame, memory, and power, do not end when a body is laid to rest. They persist in margins, in the gloss of headlines, in the whispers that survive after the sirens fade. This is not a claim about what happened in the past. It is an exploration of what happens when a record refuses to lie still, when a room at 100 North Carrollwood Drive seems to hum with a different color of truth. In this alternate chronicle, we consider a world where the undertow of rumor collides with the gravity of documents, and a living Michael Jackson walks through the corridors of his own mansion as if the doors themselves remember him. The record may not tell the whole story. The investigation that began in the coroner's hall moves, as in any great mystery, toward the archives of testimony, receipts, and memory's echoes, the rooms where endings were written, and the rooms where memory keeps its own alternate versions. The path ahead threads back through the hours leading to the alarm, the medical steps that followed, and the people who held keys to the room at 100 North Carrollwood Drive. The next chapter begins with those voices and documents, the first interviews, the earliest receipts, the whispers that persist in the margins of the record. By August 28, 2009, the medical examiner had delivered a verdict shaped by an improbable junction of events. The official findings did not declare accidental overdose, nor natural causes. It declared homicide, with the specific cause identified as acute propofol intoxication. This single word, homicide, was the first official crack in a narrative that had once seemed serenely tragic, private, and closed. It confirmed that the death was not a mere misfortune, but an act in a chain of events that could invite negligence, intent, and a possible cover-up to the surface of public scrutiny. The legal consequence was the trial of Dr. Conrad Murray, charged and convicted of involuntary manslaughter in 2011. 4 years were allotted by the court, but the record of those years did not always align with the sentiment of justice felt by many who followed the case globally. Time off for good behavior shortened the sentence, and the public frame of the outcome often appeared more like a partial exit than a resounding conclusion. The case, in that sense, remained a doorway, not a wall. Within the heart of this doorway, a paradox began to surface, the propofol paradox. At the center of the trial was a riddle of mathematics and pharmacology. Could a physician's actions, as described, produce a blood and tissue-level profile that matched a larger, more dangerous exposure? Dr. Murray had claimed to administer a small bolus, 25 milligrams of propofol during a moment of crisis. This was presented as a modest dose, the kind that might accompany routine sedation or the hurried steps of a difficult rescue. But the pharmacology could not be reconciled with the autopsy data. The toxicology report revealed propofol levels in the blood and tissue that implied a dose much greater than a single minor bolus. Investigators found an environment saturated with anesthetic paraphernalia, multiple vials, some empty, the floor of the room littered with the lingering codes of a medical scene not easily dismissed as incidental. The clash became not merely a matter of numbers, but a clash of stories. The doctor's narrative of a brief, controlled intervention against a map of residues and remnants that suggested a far more complex and potentially ruinous sequence of events. In this alternate history, that clash is not confined to courtroom walls. It begins to unfold within the labyrinth that leads from the coroner's hall into a mansion whose rooms hold echoes of public life and private pressures alike. The mansion at North Carrollwood Drive, already a symbol of artistic triumph and the merciless glare of the public eye, enters the narrative as a stage where memory and rumor play their own game. The doors, the staircases, the studio spaces, the medical cabinet. Each room holds the possibility of a different version of what happened on the day that changed the world's sense of celebrity, medicine, and the limits of control. In the newly unearthed sections of this chronicle, investigators encounter a pattern familiar to readers of true crime and to watchers of power. The margins of the record are not empty. They are rich with the texture of what people believed, what people suspected, and what people hoped would remain hidden. A cache of receipts offers a record not just of purchases, but of intentions, the kind of minutiae that can tip a story from tragedy into conspiracy. The earliest interviews, once read in the soft light of the courtroom, take on a different gravity when juxtaposed with a living, breathing presence that strolls through a mansion designed, in part, as a sanctuary from the world's gaze. What if, in this timeline, the body that investigators believed they had identified did not vanish from the world, but instead quietly slipped away from the world's certainty? The notion is not that a body can simply disappear, but that the perception of death can be manipulated by the architecture of memory, by the timing of disclosures, and by the way stories travel through media ecosystems that crave closure. The rooms of the house become a map of potential second chances, with corridors that retain dry footprints of a life thought to be extinguished. A master suite where a door, once left ajar, reveals a figure who was both familiar and unfamiliar. A studio where a voice records new melodies, not for a tour, but for a comeback that has been rehearsed in the silence between each heartbeat. The theoretical reality imagined here does not pretend to dismiss medical fact or forensic method. It places those facts within a larger question. What if the human element, the desire for absolution, the fear of a public judgment, the longing for a final quiet moment away from the world, could bend even the most scrutinized narrative toward a revision? In this version, investigators discover that the story they had assembled, based on autopsies, toxicology, and courtroom testimony, sits atop another story, one that runs parallel to the visible timeline. A living figure moves through the mansion's concealed passages, seemingly aware of every lens trained on him, every headline that would be written if the truth emerged in the light of day. To illuminate this alternate path, the documentary gathers voices from the environment around the case, the people who stood close to the siren of fame, the guardians who kept watch over a private life under relentless public notice, and the family who bore a weight that no amount of medical certainty could easily ease. The Jackson family, as a source for this reconstruction, speak not as a chorus of scandal, but as a set of witnesses to the human stakes involved when a life in the spotlight collides with the ordinary desire for privacy, rest, and renewal. Their accounts offer texture, the way the mansion's corridors are used to rehearse performances, the way a living space can become a sanctuary or a trap, the way a fortune can become a constraint, and the way memory can be both a guide and a veil. In the rooms where receipts lay like fallen leaves, a new sort of evidence emerges. Evidence not about a death, but about a life that has continued in a walled world where daylight seldom penetrates the stone. The investigation in this timeline asks, how would the public narrative shift if the living person behind the name were observed? Not through the lens of a crime, but through the lens of a life, managed, protected, and kept out of sight for reasons that extend beyond scandal. What kind of documentary would follow a man who has walked through the shadow of a death sentence not to confront a verdict, but to protect a secret? The questions are not simply sensational. They probe the ethics of revelation, the responsibilities of those who guard and broadcast memory, and the fragile line between truth and interpretation when reality itself seems to bend. As the examination unfolds, the scene expands beyond the courtroom and the medical examiner's office. The propofol conversation, the paradox that turned on pharmacology and probability, becomes a hinge for broader inquiries. When memory and record do not align, when a figure believed to be departed is discovered to be present, how does society recalibrate the idea of testimony, guilt, and accountability? The narrative does not escape the possibility that a public perception of justice could be shaped by the presence of a living, performing, and carefully protected icon. It follows the thread to interviews conducted in rooms that have seen megastars, where a physician's memory of events collides with a family's recollection of impossibly private moments, and with a press corps that can never quite separate spectacle from truth. In this reimagined sequence, the mansion itself becomes a witness. The architecture, its staircases, its hidden passageways, its secure vaults for personal artifacts, offers a physical metaphor for the way belief travels through society. The rooms keep the imprint of a life that continues to influence music, culture, and the philosophy of fame long after a single day's breath ceased to move the world. Yet the narration remains faithful to the core impulse of a documentary, to present what can be observed, to test each claim against the record, and to acknowledge the limits of what can be known. The viewers are invited to weigh the alternating textures of evidence, the tangible halls filled with instruments and journals, the digital records that trace calls and movements, the testimonies that reflect both fear and hope, and the testimonies that challenge the reliability of every account that has come before. In the margins of the official file, a new thread appears, not in contradiction to what was proven, but in conversation with it. The discovery does not erase the earlier facts, it reframes them. The autopsy's verdict, the dashboard of toxicology results, the courtroom arguments, these remain anchors in the sea of inquiry. But the alternate scenario introduces a countercurrent, a living presence who crafts a life within the confines of a famous residence, whose days are measured not by the urgency of a sensational new revelation, but by the patient cadence of a private world that refuses to surrender to oblivion. The narrative thus opens a space for examination and reflection, not to sensationalize, but to illuminate how stories are kept alive in the face of overwhelming public interest. What emerges then is a documentary that threads through time, through the day the alarm sounded, through the court's deliberations, through the quiet rooms of a mansion where music and memory mingle. It asks the audience to consider not only the facts as they stood, but the possibility that a life might endure in a form that the world was ready to dismiss. It asks whether justice is a fixed point or a living process, contingent as much on perception as on evidence. And it asks what it would mean for a culture built on narratives of conquest and tragedy to reconcile the idea that a character as monumental as Michael Jackson could persevere in defiance of a definitive, public declaration of death. The exploration is not a rebuke of the past, nor a prescription for a new verdict. It is an invitation to follow the trail of memory into the rooms where the story remains unfinished, where receipts are not merely financial records, but fragments of intent, where interviews are not only testimonies about a crime, but conversations about identity, fame, and the right to be seen anew. It is a journey through a mansion that has witnessed the crescendo of a life and now guards a second, quieter, more protean truth. In such a space, the line between fact and fiction blurs in ways that challenge the observer to discern what a narrative is for: to explain, to heal, to provoke, or to endure. And so the investigation continues, not as a closure, but as a continuation, the search for what remains alive within the walls and within the public record. If a living Michael Jackson does reside in the mansion, the implications stretch beyond a single person or a single event. They touch on the ethics of memory, the responsibilities of documentation, and the human need to believe that life can outlast its own countdown. In this way, the story remains open, the doors still turning on their hinges, the corridors offering new echoes for every future observer to hear. The next phase of the narrative will ask not only what happened, but who remains willing to tell the remainder of the tale, and how a life, once counted in charts and headlines, continues to shape the world it left behind. What happens when a life exits the stage of headlines is not silence, but a chorus of echoes that keep rearranging the world it touched. Each ripple becomes a thread in the larger fabric, weaving through families, neighborhoods, and networks in ways that aren't always visible at first glance. The influence doesn't vanish with the last breath. It refines, reframes, and refuels the actions of people who come after. In this sense, a life that was counted in headlines continues to count, by the outcomes it leaves behind and by the habits it inspires in others. Memory persists as a living map. Stories are told around kitchen tables, photos are pulled from dusty boxes, and a name reappears in a child's school project or a local documentary. These recollections anchor a community's sense of self, converting personal history into shared meaning. Monuments, plaques, and anniversaries translate private moments into public memory, guiding future generations as they navigate identity and belonging. Even when facts fade, the emotional resonance remains, a quiet compass that helps people decide who they want to be. Data and archives extend the reach of a life far beyond what any obituary could contain. Every email, every decision logged in a system, every public post creates a trail that researchers and policymakers can study. Algorithms may reference past choices to predict needs, shape votes, or tailor services, turning intimate actions into actionable patterns. The archivist's task, preservation, accessibility, and contextualization, becomes a form of stewardship, ensuring that later minds can learn from what was done and why. The risk, of course, is simplification. Complex motives can be reduced to metrics, and nuance can be lost unless someone vigilantly keeps the record honest. Institutions and mentorship act as the living continuities of a life. Foundations established in a name fund programs, scholarships, and labs that outlive their founders' tenure. Even the choice to share resources openly, open source software, community funds, or cooperative models, reframes what wealth can do in a society that must constantly reinvent itself.